I don't know about y'all, but I really came to praise God and give thanks for Pastor Melvin Jordan. If that's why you're here, put your hands together. This is a celebration. Let's remember that. And I'm so glad. No more pain, no more suffering. He is where he is. That felt good. Man, when I was asked to memorialize my grandfather on last week, I was honored. I do count it an honor and a blessing to have known such a great man as Melvin Jordan. I immediately went home and I started thinking about all the things that I could tell you guys about my granddad. And as I began to think, it just started to come. And I had all these stories. And then I woke up this morning, they told me I had a time limit. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but if I could get your undivided attention for the next 4 days, I think I'll get through it. But no, if you ever spent any time around my granddaddy, then you know that he was an awesome man. He was also a man of God, and he preached, and he walked exactly what he preached. My granddaddy, if you've ever been around him, you know that his spirit is so quiet, and he didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. I can remember many times when we used to come back to Chattanooga when we were living in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I would be so excited because I knew that we were going to Granddaddy and Grandmama's house, and I couldn't wait to get there. And I remember how I would get to Grandma's house, and the first place I go is the Granddaddy's office, and I knock on it, and he may not be there. So I come back an hour later, and I come and I knock again, and he may not be there. But there was a third knock, and I knock, and you hear that soft voice, well, come on in. And when you walked in, you were immediately hit with that cologne and peppermint smell. Granddaddy would wear that Aramis or that Eternity, and it was just so warm and it hit you. And I would go in, and I would see him. He'd be so cool in his little lazy boy chair. And I would either sit on his lap or I'd sit right by his feet, and I would just talk to him, and I would say, Granddad, tell me a story. And Granddaddy would go on and on and on about a story. And I listened. Granddaddy would tell me stories about him growing up and the struggle and how far we've come as a people and how it's very important to keep his legacy and everything that he's taught, to instill it in my children. And I took that, and I take everything that he's taught me, and I embodied it. And I hope that one day I can be as great of a man as he was. And out of talking to him, you would get so much wisdom and knowledge from him. And one story that comes to mind is when he made a surprise trip to Fort Wayne, Indiana, like he would so often do when he was either doing a revival, maybe Ohio or Indianapolis. He would always stop by. And I remember this one particular surprise visit. I was outside, and I was tossing pennies. And I was just throwing pennies, and I was throwing pennies. And all of a sudden, this Lincoln pulls up. And I say, I've seen that car before. And lo and behold, he turned that corner on Autumn Lane, and he pulled up, and he rolled down that window. And I jumped up, and I ran to Granddaddy. And he opened the door, and I grabbed him around his waist. He picked me up, and he brought me into the house. And he set me on his lap. And I began to rub that bald head. And let me tell you how much wisdom Granddaddy had. Granddaddy said, one day you're going to look like me. I said, can't be. He knew what he was talking about. But on this particular day, Granddaddy taught me a very valuable lesson that I hold to this day. I was outside throwing those pennies, and he noticed. He said, grandson, what were you doing outside? I said, I was tossing pennies. He said, why would you toss pennies? I said, because they're pennies. They're not quarters, they're the least amount. He said, that's not true. He said, go outside and pick up those pennies. So I went outside and I picked up every last penny and I brought them to him. And he said, open your hand. I opened my hand and he said, never throw out the pennies. I said, why? He said, because the more pennies you collect, the greater the reward. And I sat there and I'm thinking, if I collect pennies, it's only going to mean I'm going to have $1 eventually. But what he taught me was a double meaning. I didn't realize until last week when I started thinking about that story what he actually meant. Granddaddy Melvin lived his life by that. Never throw out the pennies. See, too many times we look at individuals as being the least of the amount. Sometimes we look at individuals as those who don't mean as much as so-and-so. But Granddaddy was a firm believer that if you collect those pennies, Granddaddy devoted his life to preaching and collecting who those said were the least amount. And what I learned was the more souls that he collected and helped collect and get to God, his reward is that much greater. So I tell you and everybody else who love Granddaddy Melvin to continue that legacy, continue to collect the pennies. And if you do it and you mean it in your heart, then you will one day get that great reward and we'll see him again. And I just thank God for Granddaddy, a man like him, and placing him in my life, and I'm going to miss him.